This is Franklin Rye, and welcome back to Political Spirits. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, let's talk again about the Mueller Report. So I understand the finding of no collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. In fact, there was no finding of collusion between any American and the Russians. What I don't understand is, given that the special counsel did not reach a conclusion that the president obstructed justice, why is there a Part 2 of the report? Why is there a section detailing 10 incidents that were investigated as potential obstruction of justice? You don't see other federal prosecutors releasing the details of investigations when they reach a conclusion that there's not sufficient evidence to charge. In that respect, it almost seems like Mueller felt part of his responsibility was to give Congress evidence so they could consider whether they wanted to try to pursue actions such as impeachment. Since when is that the special counsel's role? Have you seen other federal prosecutors conduct an investigation where the conclusion reached is that there is not sufficient basis to charge, and then release a report detailing all of the incidents evaluated where the conduct may have been less than stellar or well less than stellar, but not sufficient to charge criminally? Since when do federal prosecutors release the details when they conclude there is not sufficient evidence of a crime? Reports from prosecutors are not balanced. They're framed from the perspective of the prosecutor. They don't include the countervailing responses of counsel for the parties referenced in the report. That's why they don't get released when there's been no finding that criminal charges are justified. Mueller's conduct in that respect reeks of CYA. Did he fill his team with so many die-hard Hillary supporters that he figured the info would leak anyway and be spun to make him look bad? So why not release it all from the start? Let's look back to the genesis of the investigation for a moment. Allegations were made that the Russians had interfered in the U.S. presidential election and that the Trump campaign had colluded with them. According to the memorandum setting out the appointment of the special counsel, the core matter to be investigated was set forth in the title of the memorandum. Quote, "To investigate Russian interference with the 2016 presidential election." Close quote. And the first item listed in the matters to be investigated in the body of the document was, quote, "any links and/or coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the campaign of President Donald Trump." Close quote. The person who signed the memorandum on May 17, 2017, was Acting Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. Recall, Attorney General Jeff Sessions had recused himself from involvement in the investigation. Remember, the investigation didn't start with the appointment of the special counsel. It had begun long before in the FBI under Director James Comey. After Comey was dismissed by President Trump, Comey leaked to a friend excerpts of a private conversation he had with President Trump regarding National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who Trump had just dismissed, and asked a friend to share it with the press. Comey acknowledged his hope was that the leak to the press would spur appointment of a special counsel. That is in fact what happened, as Rosenstein appointed special counsel Robert Mueller. There has been some extremely well-written commentary from writers who were generally on the left, but who've evaluated the conclusions reached by Robert Mueller and concluded that the media needs to do a great deal of soul-searching, yet is showing little inclination to do so. Incredibly, many members of the media, as well as many Democratic politicians, continue to insist that collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians did occur. On that point, Mark Penn, formerly of the Bill Clinton administration, guts their arguments clearly and succinctly in an article in The Hill dated April 19, when he says, quote, Special Counsel Robert Mueller's team systematically targeted the people around the president, squeezing them like lemons, indicting them on mostly process crimes created by the investigation itself. They reviewed everyone's emails, text messages, phone calls, bank statements, and yet their conclusion on collusion was clear and definitive. It has to be believed. Making the distinction between the results of the Mueller investigation and the results of independent counsel Kenneth Starr's Whitewater investigation of the Clintons, Penn notes, quote, the big difference between today and what happened in 1998 or during the Nixon era is that at the end of the day, the Mueller investigators found no stained dress, no break-in, no hush money, no enemies list. There never was a crime. And what seemed far-fetched was simply that. This time, a duly elected president was investigated for a crime that never even existed. In fact, evidence is mounting that the investigation itself was launched on phony grounds. Close quote. With regard to the media's recent obsession with obstruction of justice, Penn concludes that the evidence is, quote, a lot weaker than I thought it would be, because the alleged acts of obstruction are nothing more than the acts the president could have legally taken or ordered. While talking a tough game publicly and brooding in private, the president and his legal team gave unprecedented access to White House documents and personnel. Close quote. Penn is absolutely right. I expected the president to claim executive privilege. He didn't. He cooperated fully, but virtually none of the media is giving him credit for having done so. I highly recommend you read the Mark Penn piece in The Hill. The second commentary by a liberal journalist, which I highly recommend you examine, is by Glenn Greenwald. Ian Schwartz posted in RealClearPolitics.com comments made by Greenwald during an interview by Tucker Carlson following the Mueller Report release. The post is entitled, quote, Donald Trump broke the brains of a lot of people, close quote, and it appears on RealClearPolitics.com on April 19. The most insightful part of the post? Quote, I think that in a lot of ways Donald Trump broke the brains of a lot of people, particularly people in the media, who believe the telling lies, inventing conspiracy theories, being journalistically reckless, is all justified to stop this unparalleled menace, he said. Quote, and that's a good thing for an activist to think, and a really bad thing for a journalist to think. Close quote. Well said, Glenn Greenwald. Then there's a shocking acknowledgement in an article in the New York Times, of all places. That acknowledgement addresses a point that I've been making for well over a year. That point is that the dossier that was used to commence this investigation may actually be Russian disinformation intended to destabilize America politically. In other words, the investigation that was purportedly started because of concerns about a potential effort by Russia to destabilize America politically may actually have performed that function which the Russians were pursuing. The investigation itself may have fulfilled the Russian goal of interfering in our political system to destabilize it. The Steele Dossier, which was commissioned by Fusion GPS through hiring of Christopher Steele, a former British intelligence agent, who then collected information which was unverified from Russian sources, was used in support of FISA court warrants issued for Trump campaign official Carter Page. Some of the information in the dossier has been proven false, and none of the substantive info in it has been verified. Incredibly, as Democrats have self-righteously proclaimed for 2 years that the Mueller investigation would bring down Trump for collusion with the Russians, it is the actual genesis of the investigation itself which is the product of collusion. The Democratic National Committee and the Hillary Clinton campaign retained Fusion GPS, but didn't do so directly, and instead did so through the law firm Perkins Coie, which provided them with some level of insulation from discovery. Fusion GPS then retained the services of Christopher Steele, who obtained information from Russian sources and compiled the dossier. The New York Times article, dated April 19 and authored by Scott Shane, Adam Goldman, and Matthew Rosenberg, is entitled Mueller Report Likely to Renew Scrutiny of Steele Dossier. The most eye-opening information in the article, which supports what I've been saying for more than a year, quote, there has been much chatter among intelligence experts that Mr. Steele's Russian informants could have been pressured to feed him disinformation. Close quote. Daniel Hoffman, a former CIA officer who served in Moscow, said he has long suspected the dossier was contaminated by Russian fabrications. The goal, he said, would be to deepen American divisions and blur the line between truth and falsehood. How many times have hearings on Capitol Hill used information from the dossier? Mr. Hoffman said. How much damage has it already caused? Close quote. The damage it's caused to the reputation of the media has been extensive, to say the least. The media's reputation has been damaged far more than President Trump's in this ordeal. Moreover, the origin of this investigation is dirty as hell. But it was accepted, likely because of Democratic Party loyalties and entrenched bureaucrats supported by Democrats and never-Trump Republicans trying to prevent Trump from attacking the entrenched bureaucratic interests he was elected to attack. In short, it was an attempt to undermine the will of the people expressed through an election. Notwithstanding President Trump's sometimes off-putting behavior, it's the origin of the Mueller investigation that is the most fundamentally disturbing part of this entire ordeal. It calls into question whether our own government bureaucracy really supports the democratic electoral process in our constitutional republic. I draw some comfort from the fact that the Inspector General's investigation of the origins of the Russiagate investigation is still ongoing. I won't set my hopes too high that individuals who engaged in misconduct, which I would argue essentially amounted to an attempted soft coup, will actually be held to account for their actions. But it might happen. As the Democrats in Congress do their best to keep the collusion illusion alive and contend that the president should be impeached for threatening to take actions which fell within his authority, my focus will be on the Inspector General's investigation. My suspicion is that the investigation will find that department policies were not followed and that the FISA court was misled. The question will be whether any of those actions is prosecuted as a crime. We'll have to wait and see. Next topic. Recent positive signs among college leadership. We've talked so many times on this podcast about instances of college administrators kowtowing to students wanting to censor voices on the right, disinvite them from speaking events, or throw up obstructions to prevent them from speaking, that frankly I've lost track of the number of times we've had those discussions. We've all followed events where left-wing students have insisted that speakers be disinvited, and administrators have given in to those demands. Or at Evergreen College, that all whites leave the campus on a particular day, and when a professor refused, he was forced off campus by aggressive leftist students, some of whom were carrying bats, and administrators didn't stop them. So I was frankly surprised and encouraged when I recently read about some positive developments in this arena. Specifically, two prominent public figures who grate on the politically correct left were actually supported by college administrators. I'll start with one of the public figures who's certainly not politically correct, but could by no means be described as a conservative. That person is Camille Paglia. If you haven't heard of her, she spells her last name Paglia. She is an academic, an author, and a social critic. Her most famous book is Sexual Personae, Art and Decadence from Nefertiti to Emily Dickinson. When she's interviewed for a written article, I will eagerly read it. When she's interviewed on video, I will often watch, but not nearly as often as I read interviews with her. The reason is that she has a manic style of speaking that takes getting used to, but she's a brilliant writer, and perhaps as a result, when her thoughts are condensed onto a page, they're more easily consumed. The fact that I enjoy reading interviews with Camille Paglia is a pretty good example of me actually following my guidance that you shouldn't live in a bubble and should get some of your news and opinion from sources that don't agree with you. Camille Paglia is a liberal, but when it comes to feminism, she has been extremely critical of the left. She is perhaps most critical of feminism as it currently exists on college campuses, including being harshly critical of the Me Too movement. As I've noted previously in conversations and on Twitter, Ms. Paglia has a talent for producing controversial and thought-provoking quotes. Perhaps the most controversial of her recent statements have to do with the Me Too movement, criticism of campus feminism, and celebration of victimhood. She contrasted those with the strong female represented as the ideal in earlier feminism. Her criticisms included questioning why any college would accept sexual assault claims more than 6 months after the event purportedly occurred. Those statements, which were made in an interview given in 2016, as well as criticism of the transgender movement, prompted the recent attempts to silence Ms. Paglia. They took the form of demands from activist campus leftists that she be fired from her position at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. Ms. Paglia was giving a lecture on Nefertiti in Egyptian design when a fire alarm was set off. When I heard about the effort to force the sacking of Ms. Paglia, and that it had progressed, or regressed actually, to the point where fire alarms were being pulled to prevent her lectures from being heard, I was really concerned that the college administration would find a way to force her out. So imagine my surprise when I read that the University of the Arts president, David Yeager, didn't just stand by Ms. Paglia, but rather he actually rebuked the students for their attempted censorship. His email to the student body is a breath of fresh air. His message, quote, "Unfortunately, as a society, we are living out a time of sharp divisions, of opinions, perspectives, and beliefs, and that has led to decreased civility, increased anger, and a new normal of offense given and taken. Across our nation, it is all too common that opinions expressed that differ from another's, especially those that are controversial, can spark passion and even outrage, and often result in calls to suppress that speech. That simply cannot be allowed to happen. I firmly believe that limiting the range of voices in our society erodes our democracy. Universities, moreover, are at the heart of the revolutionary notion of free expression. Promoting the free exchange of their ideas is part of the core reason for their existence." Close quote. He goes on to explain how the University of the Arts is committed to the free exchange of ideas and respectful intellectual debate. Quote, "I believe this resolve holds even greater importance at an art school. Artists over the centuries have suffered censorship and even persecution for their expression of their beliefs through their work. My answer is simple: not now, not at UArts." Close quote. Wow. Perfect. I wish every college president responded that way. For the details regarding the Paglia and UArts story, look to the April 16, 2019 edition of Quillette and an article by Claire Lehman entitled, "A College President Stands Up for Academic Freedom." So I mentioned there were 2 instances of college administrators pushing back against the censors among the student body. The second one involves George Mason University, and the person many on the left would most like to see expunged from public life, Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. To the consternation of those on the left, George Mason University's law school hired Justice Kavanaugh to teach a summer class in England for the university. That was simply too much for the leftists who consider Kavanaugh to be an attempted rapist, notwithstanding the fact that no charges have ever been filed against him, and the only evidence ever presented against him was the testimony of a professor who couldn't remember where it supposedly happened, who was with her there at the function, or how she got there or left, was inconsistent about what year it happened, and who waited 37 years before raising the issue. The nearly apoplectic students and other leftists were able to get 10,000 signatures on a petition to force cancellation of Kavanaugh's engagement. The campus administration called a town hall to speak with the student body. The university provost, S. David Wu, was apparently doing his best impersonation of the president of the University of the Arts because his statement was simple and to the point. He noted it was the law school's choice to hire Kavanaugh, and that he was going to protect the law school's power to retain those it wishes to retain. Another member of the administration was asked by a HuffPost reporter whether there was any possibility of the school reconsidering its contract with Kavanaugh if there were continued protests from students asserting that the Kavanaugh appointment causes them to, quote, revisit their own sexual trauma, close quote. The response? No, it's done. That's exactly the kind of response that the actions of the would-be censors on the left call for, and it's the kind of response I would hope we'll be seeing much more going forward. At Political Spirits, the podcast will continue to be direct, to the point, and blunt when called for. I'll be releasing the next direct, to the point episode next week, and I hope you'll make it a point to listen. Until then, be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits, and remember to tell your friends in other states too, and follow me on Twitter at Franklin Rye. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.